we asked scientists and engineers to develop a machine that soaks up carbon from the atmosphere. A device that would lock up CO2 for potentially quite a long time. It would have to be environmentally friendly, of course, efficient, reliable, easy and cheap to produce. Here's what they came up with. Trees and forests play a crucial role in regulating our climate. Through photosynthesis, they remove carbon from the atmosphere as they grow, binding CO2 and storing it as carbon. The carbon is held in the forest biomass, in the trunks, branches, foliage and roots, and as organic carbon in the soil. The process is constant and is going on all around us. In young forests, carbon is soaked up or sequestered quickly, while in mature forests, sequestration eventually equals decomposition and the carbon balance reaches a steady state. At this point, the forest doesn't absorb any more carbon, but it has become a vast carbon reservoir. But if the trees are destroyed, they release carbon back to the atmosphere, thus becoming a source of greenhouse gas emissions. However, when they grow back or are replanted, the cycle starts all over again and the new trees absorb more carbon. Forests cover just under 4 billion hectares of the world's surface. That's almost 1/3 of our total land area. They account for 90% of the annual interchange of carbon between the atmosphere and the land. The amount of carbon stored in these ecosystems is the equivalent of around 4,500 gigatons of CO2. That's more than the total carbon contained in all of the world's remaining oil stocks. More, in fact, than the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere itself. So it's no surprise that forests can be a big part of the answer to the problem of climate change. But we're not looking after them. 8,000 years ago, half of the Earth's land surface was covered by forest. Today, that's down to less than 1/3. Since 1850, deforestation has released around 120 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. The world is still losing forests at an alarming rate. Between 1990 and 2005, around 13 million hectares of forest were lost every year. That's an area roughly equivalent to the size of Greece. Tropical countries are most vulnerable. South America suffered the largest net loss of forests from 2000 to 2005, about 4.3 million hectares every year. This was followed by Africa, which lost 4 million hectares per year. The main cause of deforestation was conversion to agriculture, large scale in Latin America, small scale in Africa, and a mix in Asia. Added to this, all regions suffer forest degradation from causes that include overharvesting or poor harvesting practices, overgrazing and forest fires, to name a few. It's a grim statistic, but the forest sector accounts for nearly 1/5 of all the world's greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than the emissions from every car, every boat, every plane in the world. More than the whole of the world's transport sector put together. Most of this is due to deforestation, but some also to forest degradation. But experience in some regions shows that the tide can be turned. Large areas of European and North American forest were cleared centuries ago. In these regions, forest cover is now increasing. Asia, which had a net loss of some 800,000 hectares a year in the 1990s, reported a net gain of 1 million hectares a year from 2000 to 2005, primarily as a result of large-scale afforestation by China. Countries are increasing their efforts to conserve forests and manage them sustainably. This is vital not only to regulate our climate, but also because forests provide flood protection, erosion control, timber and other products. They are essential for the planet's biodiversity. 2 out of 3 living species depend on our forests. And forests are also important for sustaining livelihoods. About 450 million people worldwide live off the forest. The loss of forests affects everyone, particularly the world's poorest people. The forest sector can make a big difference in helping to reverse the situation. Our contribution to climate change mitigation through forest management can come about in 3 main ways. By conserving and managing existing forests, we can protect and maintain the carbon already locked up in them. If we tackle the causes of deforestation, we can reduce the rate and amount of loss of forest cover. Of course, this also protects the ecosystem services that forests provide. And by planting new forests and re-establishing those we have lost, we can restore the planet's forest cover. Schemes that encourage individuals, businesses and others to offset their emissions by planting trees can be valuable but must enact just as a salve to our environmental conscience. Where offsetting can be valuable is when emissions can't be avoided. People and companies need to know that money will bring real benefits, real cuts in emissions that actually make a difference. So we need agreed standards to provide that reassurance. Another thing we can do is use more wood in our everyday lives. Wood is a source of bioenergy which can replace fossil fuels and avoid their emissions. Burning wood also releases CO2. However, if new trees are grown, they take up CO2, thus neutralizing the earlier emissions. In developing countries, wood, usually in the form of fuel wood or charcoal, is the most important source of energy for 2 billion people. These are mostly poor people who have no access to other energy sources. Understandably, there is great interest in producing liquid biofuels in developing countries, but if this means destroying forests, then it does more harm than good. Sustainable biofuel production can also give jobs and income to poor families. With governments committing to fossil fuel alternatives, the use of biomass for electricity generation is forecast to triple between now and 2030. There are also great opportunities for small-scale wood-based heating schemes in areas currently dependent on fossil fuels, such as oil and coal. Wood is also a raw material. Producing wood takes less energy and emits less greenhouse gas than producing any other commonly used building material. And the wood stores carbon as long as the building or furniture remains. Replacing 1 cubic meter of concrete or red brick with the same volume of timber can save around 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Designing future buildings to use more wood instead of concrete, plastic and steel could result in a significant drop in greenhouse gas emissions. Wood products are unique. They come from a natural, renewable, sustainable resource. The carbon they contain remains stored for the duration of the product's lifetime until it decays or is burnt. A global increase in the use of industrial wood products would help reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. While we can take measures now to curb the greenhouse gas emissions, the benefits of this won't be apparent for some time. changes to our climate over the next 30 to 40 years, caused by past emissions, are largely inevitable. Scientists predict more frequent heat waves in some areas, in others, heavier rainfall. More tropical cyclones are expected and also more severe storms. The sea level will rise. Many glaciers will melt. Many plant and animal species are expected to go extinct. Many others will move into new areas, for example, shifting towards the poles or higher elevations. These changes will influence forests in all regions. For example, in Africa, lower rainfall is expected to decrease forest productivity and increase the area of dryland forests. In Latin America, the forest of the eastern Amazon is expected to be replaced by savanna. In North America and Northern Europe, higher temperatures may make forests more productive and alter the ranges of some species. To take one example, this map shows the predicted change in suitable sites for oak woodland in the United Kingdom under a high emission scenario. It is quite a dramatic shift. Changes will vary though from one region to another. Scotland, Northern England and much of Wales could see increased tree growth because of rising CO2 levels, a longer growing season and generally warmer climate. Whereas in other areas of England, more summer droughts could lead to a decrease in the growth rates of many tree species. Trees under stress are also more susceptible to harmful insect pests and diseases. Recent outbreaks of insect pests, especially in temperate regions, have been linked to alterations in their fertility and mortality related to climate change. The health and character of forests is changing around the world. We need to adapt and plan ahead for these changes. We need to manage forests and woodlands to cope and help us cope with the new climate, ensuring they contribute to flood prevention, develop habitat networks, and create wildlife corridors. When we plant forests, we need to give careful consideration to species choice, particularly where timber production is important. Above all, we need to understand how climate change will affect vulnerable people and how forest and tree management can help them adapt. Achieving the transition from deforestation to forest conservation and management is a huge challenge. Forests need to be managed sustainably. Action to protect forests can be complemented by action to increase the uptake of CO2 in trees and soils. And some of these actions can also help us adapt to climate change. There's no doubt that protecting, conserving, and managing forests sustainably comes at a cost. It also requires the commitment of resources. But research shows that it can be cost-effective. Every country in the world gains from maintaining forest resources that provide public goods. Finding ways to compensate the countries that provide a global service in this way will encourage conservation. We should be optimistic. We know what needs to be done. We need to protect and manage what we already have. We must reduce deforestation and forest degradation and restore more of the world's forest cover. We should use more wood for energy and use it in place of other materials. Finally, we need to plan to adapt to our changing climate. We must ensure the livelihoods of forest-dependent people and safeguard the ecosystem services of forests for all of us. If we get this right, the world's forest sector can help to solve this global problem. Morally, we have always had an obligation to protect and manage our forests for future generations. We now have the power and the strongest possible imperative to do something. We understand the predicament have the knowledge to see what needs to be done, and have the skills and the technology to do it. We now have to show we also have the will.